There we go, there's that lovely voice. Bear with me. Okay, can you see that screen saying what we will cover today? Amazing. So for the folks who just joined, you will have noticed that my name is not Jessica. So Jessica and I were meant to be doing this training together, but unfortunately she's unwell. So I'm going to be reading a script for her parts. And we have kind of all of the content that she would have shared. So hopefully there'll still be some really interesting content in there, and I'll share Jessica's email at the end. So if you have any questions that I'm unable to answer, since I'm not a climate psychologist, Jessica is really happy to be emailed and to take questions that way. So today we're going to split the training into two parts, which is how we would have split it up between Jessica and I. So the first part is going to be looking at climate activism and mental health specifically. We're going to close up that part with breakout rooms, doing an active listening exercise, and then we'll have a short break, which should be around halfway through. And then part two is going to look at building resilience in our groups, so around collective care and building joy into our groups in the way that we organise. And then we're going to finish that again with another active listening exercise before closing. Hopefully that sounds okay to you and what you are prepared to engage with. Okay, so this is where I become Jessica. So part one is looking at activism and mental health. I'm going to start by sharing these headlines, and I'd love it if you could put in the chat what these headlines make you feel. So they're, what have we got there? We've got headlines like, soon the world will be unrecognizable. It's still possible. Is it still possible to prevent total climate meltdown? Major climate changes, inevitable and irreversible. What comes after the coming climate anarchy? So what are these headlines making you feel when you're reading them? I know for me that they don't make me feel anything good. Climate crisis, UN finds no credible pathway to 1.5 degrees C in place. Climate endgame, risk of human extinction, dangerously underexplored. Heavy, yeah. Grief. I can empathize with all of those. Angry, yeah, absolutely. Worry, anxiety, anger, grief. Yeah, I can empathize with all of that. Fear. None of those good emotions, definitely. These kind of headlines are what we call climate doomism. So climate doomism is the belief that it's already too late to solve the climate crisis. Not only is that scientifically inaccurate, it's also unjust, as it's easier for folks in the global north to opt out of climate action because we think that it's too late. And our brains have evolved to pay more attention to negative information as a survival mechanism. And media outlets are clever, and they know this, and abuse this fact for clicks. So climate communication research shows that scary headlines often get shared on social media, but for the most part, don't motivate folks to take meaningful climate action. And climate doomism massively negatively impacts our mental health. It can cause the feelings that a lot of you put in the chat and around hopelessness, and also contribute to activist burnout. It's really important to know that doomism plays directly into the hands of those who do not want us to act. So when when communicating climate change to activists, it's important to outline the urgency, but then also focus on hope and solutions. So we're going to have a quick intro of how we experience existential threats. Humans have evolved to react to threats in 3 different ways. The fight, flight, and freeze response, which I'm sure you will have all heard before. And in relation to the climate crises, the fight response can look like engaging in activism, but as I'm sure we're all aware, many of us take it too far and burn ourselves out in the process. The flight response can look like avoiding the topic altogether, or even denying that the problem exists. And many of us are really quick to demonize climate deniers, but actually many of them experience intense anxiety around climate change and how it will affect them and their loved ones. And denial is their way of coping, however dysfunctional. The freeze response can look like apathy, shock, anxiety, or action paralysis, struggling to get out of bed or engage with everyday activities. And different people will respond in different ways depending on their personality, life experiences, and environment. It's also possible to fluctuate between these responses. You're not stuck in one. And all of these reactions are normal and to a certain extent healthy. Activism can help us cope with anxiety. Flight can be helpful and healthy if we take breaks from activism or reading the news. And feeling anxiety and overwhelm is absolutely normal. The important thing is that we don't get stuck in these responses and find healthy ways of coping. So some of the ways in which the climate crisis negatively impacts our mental health. Climate grief looks like grieving for the loss of ecosystems and species, whether they're present in our lives or not. Many people experience this when places they love or their home environments are just degraded or destroyed. But we can also experience climate grief, and I think grief was mentioned actually in relation to those headlines, in relation to places that we haven't experienced through our own eyes. So, for example, many people experienced intense distress while watching media coverage of the bushfires in Australia in 2020 or the wildfires in Greece in 2021. I'm sure a lot of you would have come across the phrase climate anxiety before, if not all of you. It's often described as the constant feeling of fear of environmental doom. And it's really important to stress that climate anxiety is in lots of ways a normal and healthy reaction to the crisis that we're in. But it can also lead to mental illness or exacerbate existing mental health issues. It's also worth mentioning that all of these phenomena overlap and have a lot in common with each other. But many people can benefit from having language to describe what they're experiencing, and others identify with these, and others also don't identify with these categories, which is okay as well. Here are some stats which show that climate anxiety is both widespread and a really serious issue. The University of Bath surveyed 10,000 young people around the world and found that 75% of young people think that the future is frightening. 58% feel betrayed by their governments as a result of climate inaction. 45% say climate change is affecting their daily lives. And Jessica notes that this stat is the most worrying because the general rule in psychology is that when an issue starts impacting your daily life and functioning, the person is at risk of developing mental illness. Here's some more stats showing how climate anxiety impacts our well-being. 97% of people experience reduced well-being, but climate anxiety can also have a positive impact on climate action because 74% were more pro-environmentally and 37% engaged with activism. This study was global, which is why the rate of activism is so low. In many areas of the world, being an activist isn't safe, so people tend to cope with their climate anxiety through pro-environmental behaviour instead. Of course, at a certain point, anxiety can become debilitating and reduce the positive impacts on pro-environmental behaviour. So many people, and probably a lot of people in this room, cope by channeling their feelings into activism. And it's a good way of coping with climate anxiety. Activism works and is rewarding, and in many ways, as we can connect with others experiencing similar emotions and directly tackle the things we're scared of, climate change and its impacts. But activism is not a cure for climate anxiety, and if we overdo it, it can be detrimental to our mental health. I'm sure, again, a lot of you will have come across the phrase burnout. It's the result of chronic stress and unfortunately is very common in activist communities, as we're very passionate about what we do and tend to do activism on top of existing work, family, and other personal commitments. You could compare our mental health to a plant. If you don't look after the plant, or if it doesn't get enough water, sun, and nutrients, it will wilt. And if the plant gets what it needs, it will be like the fern in the right picture, healthy and able to sustain the ecosystems around it. Burnout in activism tends to occur in 5 stages. The honeymoon phase, when you first get engaged in activism and you feel very committed, excited, and full of energy. The onset of stress, you start feeling fatigue, lower productivity, and your sleep might get worse. Chronic stress, lack of motivation, more intense symptoms more frequently, and some people start compensating with unhealthy habits. And then burnout, which is difficult to cope with minimum of daily tasks. Everything seems very dull and ugly, and you may feel numb or really overwhelmed. And then habitual burnout means that the symptoms of burnout are incorporated into your normal life. So that means chronic fatigue, depression, and feeling very apathetic. And burnout is really dangerous and can lead to long-term physical health impacts as well as the mental health impacts outlined. So as I already mentioned, as activists, we're at very high risk of burnout for a number of reasons. difficult tasks because the climate crisis is an immensely difficult problem to tackle and something we often have limited control over as individuals. There's also a number of activists who actively put their lives on the line or are risking prison sentences, and being exposed to that risk can be very difficult to deal with. And a lot of us are not compensated for our work, which means that we juggle it on top of a lot of other things. So many of us don't get a whole lot of satisfaction from our work because the environment can be stressful. Many groups have a culture of urgency. And so we have to remember that activism is not a marathon, is a marathon, not a sprint. And this group culture element is something that we're going to talk more about in the second section. The backlash is self-explanatory. Many activists get negative comments from the public, from the media, or even from their family and friends. And this is especially the case when you're part of an underrepresented group or racialized group, working within a radical climate group that's disrupting infrastructure, or when you're a public figure. And then lastly, no task completion. In the climate space, it's difficult to achieve work-life balance because the work is never done, so it can be difficult. Okay, that ends Jessica's presentation. Apologies for the scripted delivery. So we're going to talk. Nice, thank you, Louise. We're going to talk briefly now about two strategies for building resilience in ourselves and in our movements, collective care and the cultivation of joy. There's obviously countless other ways and important ways of building resilience. And as I said, we'll share the recording from a previous session where Jessica goes into more detail about individual strategies. But today we wanted to look at what can happen at a group level, which is obviously in itself really related to individual resilience, and how we can look after ourselves alongside each other. So resilience is crucial both for our own personal well-being and for building healthy and sustainable groups. It's the opposite of those cycles of burnout that we've spoken about today, and which I'm sure many of us have found ourselves in. So firstly, looking at collective care. Collective care is much more than I have on the screen, but 4 things that collective care is and isn't. It's an opportunity to make our campaigns longer lasting and more effective. It can be really easy to get sucked into the urgency of what we're working on and feel like looking after each other is a distraction from something that we don't have time for or something that we don't have time for. But taking just small steps can reduce individual and collective burnout and make it easier to work towards campaign goals in a sustainable and long-term way. Collective care is also an important part of modelling the ways of existing that we want to see in the world. Often oppression that exists in our wider society can unfortunately find its way into our groups and the ways that we show up together. But collective care is an opportunity and a commitment to work towards ways of relating to each other that we'd like to see go beyond our groups. Collective care is a radical act. Colonial capitalism as an economic and social model wants us to think and act as individuals and to see ourselves as in competition with each other. But choosing to prioritise care in our groups is an act of resistance against that. And lastly, and really importantly, collective care has limits and important limits. It's really important to recognise them. It's not a replacement for professional treatment, and it's important to be aware of your own boundaries and how much you can offer others and when you need to step back and seek support elsewhere. So a quick interjection for some movement theory geekiness, which might not immediately seem relevant, but is really relevant. I'm sure lots of you will have seen this graphic before, or a similar one. It's based on the original theory from Bill Moyer's 1987 Movement Action Plan, and it's been the basis for a lot of more recent movement theories looking at cycles of escalation. Basically, it shows how movements and campaigns go through cycles of escalation and contractions with various trigger events along the way. So our groups and movements will go through cycles of uprising, which is this bit, and peaks, usually marked by high energy and momentum, followed by periods of contraction, which in their negative state, and they're not inherently negative, but when they are in a negative way, can be associated with burnout, feelings of despair and hopelessness, and people leaving the movement. So I'm sure that you've all been in campaigns where you've experienced a really high level of energy and enthusiasm, followed by a massive dip, where some people might burn out or leave the campaign. And I know it may not seem immediately relevant for collective care, but for me, this theory of movement cycles really underlines the importance of building a culture of collective care in our groups and in our wider movements. Because when used to our advantage, that period of contraction can actually be a really crucial and positive point for rest and reflection, embedding learnings and absorbing new capacities into our movements. And collective care itself is crucial for getting us through the ups and downs and continuing to build momentum, which we can't do without resilience, that crucial word. It's also really important to note that these periods of uprising and peak following a trigger event, it tends to be where collective care is most likely to take a back seat, because it gets relegated in favour of more urgent or pressing concerns. But it's actually, in my opinion, one of the most important periods for centering care, because if we can make small changes then to look after each other, it has massive impacts in terms of the long-term sustainability and resilience of our movements. So this is another movement theory graphic, but I promise it is also really relevant. So creating healthy groups is a core part of looking after each other. And this graphic shows an onion, which is broadly representative of how a lot of groups function. So there's different layers of involvement, ranging from organisers and facilitators at the core to supporters, one layer removed, and then observers on the outer. And creating healthy groups means having mechanisms for people to move through these layers so that supporters can become organisers, organisers can become facilitators, and actually, most importantly, that there's space for the people at the core of the onion, stick with the metaphor, at the core of the onion to step back into one of the outer layers. That's because, especially in unpaid activism and organising, it's a really important act of collective care and also crucial for long-term resilience, that our groups are structured and organised in a way that allows new members to step in so that folks who need rest can step back. So that onion is a way of symbolising that continuous movement through an onion that represents a group. I hope that makes sense. We can have a little discussion about it at the end if it doesn't. So these are just a few examples that I came up with to create a culture of collective care in your spaces. I definitely haven't put all of them in, but just running through them quickly. Taking the time to have full check-ins at the start of meetings is really important, as is checking up on folks. Similarly, creating spaces for social time and seeing each other as full people and not just activists is a crucial part of looking after each other. Prioritising anti-oppression is a core part of modelling what we want to see for the wider world, and creating spaces where care is for everyone. So is accessibility and designing for access. Respecting your own and others' physical, emotional, and capacity boundaries is really important. And mutual aid, which I think Bryce mentioned earlier, whether it's financial or otherwise, can help us look after each other in tangible ways. But this is very much not an exhaustive list. And I'd love to hear from you. So if you're up for it, I would love it if you could put in the chat a way that you felt cared for, or the way that you've cared for someone else in a campaign or activist space, or a group of any form. Team bonding. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, thanks, Bryce, for sharing the zine. Yeah, I was going to share that with. Sending memes, yeah, I like that. In our Tipping Point Slack, we have a meme channel, which is used for a lot of that. Lots of tea and cake, yes, absolutely. Such an important part of looking after each other. My favourite person in any group is the person who brings biscuits. Me malicious mischief. Yeah, I think the Stop Rosebank campaign has always been quite a fan of memes. Group volunteering, doing a nice positive thing together that also helps wildlife. That's really nice. I hadn't thought of that. That's a lovely idea. Thank you, Lauren and Martin and Bruno. And making sure that meetings include breaks. Yeah, really important, both for accessibility and for collective care. Nice, thank you. All of those examples bring me so much joy, which is conveniently what we're going to be talking about next. So I'm sure you will have come across the widely used phrase, joy is an act of resistance. It comes from the title of a poem by Toy Dericotte, and it's associated with the Black feminist movement in North America. Cultivating joy in our movements is not only a way to build resilience, but it's also a radical act of resistance, especially and most importantly for people who are consistently denied access to joy by systems of oppression. And like collective care, cultivating joy is also part of creating ways of existing which model what we want to create. Like collective care, cultivating joy in our groups is an act of resistance and a highly political act, especially when it's combined with care and anti-oppression. But I do recognise that it might be odd to be talking about joy at a time when there's so much to be angry and despairing about. So I want to say that when I'm speaking about cultivating joy as a strategy for building resilience, I don't mean ignoring all of the injustice and suffering happening around us. Toxic positivity has no place here. But a key part of Joanna Macy's Active Hope, which we'll share more about at the end, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, is the act of holding our grief for the world as part of the process of generating active hope. So denying that grief and pain does not get us to joyfulness, but at the same time, cultivating joy is an important part of personal and collective resilience. And beyond anything else, joyful groups are ones that people want to be in. I'm sure that we would all agree that we're much more motivated to stay part of a group, movement or campaign where we get to cultivate joy, where we get to laugh, where we get to smile, where we get to build relationships. So I'm going to finish by, oh no, have these photos not loaded? No, damn, that's really such a shame. I'll find a way to share them at the end because they're lovely, joyful photos. But I'm sneaking in an example from a fundraiser that the Stop Rosebank group in Bristol organised last weekend, Rave Bank. And one of the photos, which you sadly can't see, is a banner saying "Rave against the oil machine." But not only did we raise £1,200 for Stop ECOP and for local organising in Bristol, we created a truly joyful space where people could dance, laugh and build relationships, while at the same time building, raising money for stuff that they care about and building up a campaign group. And for me, that's a perfect example of cultivating joy as a political act in our groups. Okay, so I'm going to stop screen sharing again now. And we're going to do another active listening exercise, hopefully in roughly the same. Amazing. Louise has got the photos. Yeah, there you go. Rave against the oil machine. It was a really lovely evening. Thanks, Louise. So hopefully we're going to be in roughly the same groups as earlier. There might be a little bit of mixing up because I think we've lost Bryce. But hopefully Louise is going to organise it so you can be with as similar people as possible. We're going to do the same format. We've also got 15 minutes, so you can take your time. The question for this one, which I'll put in the chat, is what changes can we make in our communities or groups to foster collective care and joy? So I'll put that in the chat. And hopefully once Louise has got the rooms ready, they will open and you'll have until about 7:18-ish. No problem, Alice. I think Louise has got it, so you'll stay in here again. Nice. I'm going to be so pleased when they change that Zoom recording voice. So hopefully you can see on the screen now some further resources which Jessica kindly put together for us. So there's a few groups there, some looking at mental health more generally, some looking at climate anxiety and the links between mental health and climate change and more specifically. The work that reconnects, I think I also mentioned briefly, it's related to Joanna Macy's work, and I think they actually have a free course available online if you're interested in having space to explore that more. And there's a few other links on there, which we'll share the links to these slides afterwards, so don't feel like you need to write them all down rapidly. We can share that. And similarly, there's a really big reading list here, which Jessica's put together. Reading list makes it sound quite like homework. This is not a compulsory reading list that you have to go through, but if you're interested in delving into any of these topics in a little more detail, they kind of go into some of the stuff that we touched on really lightly in a bit more depth. And again, we'll share these slides, so feel free to hold off typing and get them afterwards. Cool, okay, and then the last thing that I have to share, and I think Louise is going to kindly put it in the chat. So this training is part of the Stop Rosebank training program and also part of Tipping Point's wider training program. So we have various different trainings on a whole range of different topics, from general election campaigning to climate justice as an LGBTQI plus issue to reparations, and they're all advertised on that website and they're all free. So if you are interested in exploring any other topics with us, then you're very welcome to join us for one of those trainings. And I think maybe the link's already been shared for the Movement Powers zine, which you can order online, again for free, and those graphics which were in the second part of the training all came from that. I will share the slides and the recording and Jessica's email in a follow-up. So if you have any questions about that first part of the training, then that's a good place to go. Cool, okay, I think we can stop the recording.